The summer of 2023 marked a significant change in my life. I had recently transferred to a new position in a major Midwestern city, leaving my spouse back in California for a few more months. To bridge this transitional period, I rented a studio Airbnb in a newly renovated building in a bustling downtown neighborhood. The place was small but modern, part of a secure building with a welcoming lobby. It was an exciting new chapter, and the proximity to my hometown meant that I could visit my parents just a couple of hours drive away. Life in the new city started off great. I enjoyed exploring the neighborhood and appreciated the privacy of my fellow residents in the building maintained. However, the sense of normalcy was disrupted when a new neighbor moved in across the hall. I'll call him David for the story. David, in his 60s, stood out in a building mostly occupied by college students and young professionals. His behavior was erratic and concerning from the start. David would often sit in his car in the parking lot, staring blankly into the distance. That summer, we were experiencing fallout from the Canadian wildfires and the ash dusting our cars. David became fixated on this, accusing various tenants of deliberately spraying his car with the ash. His apartment started to emit a foul odor due to hoarded trash, and he was frequently heard yelling to himself in the hallway. Concerned, I reported these issues to the Airbnb host, but my concerns were dismissed. The host claimed to have visited David's apartment and found everything in order. In August, I planned to visit my parents for their 50th anniversary. Unfortunately, an urgent work project came up, requiring me to stay in the city for the weekend. Disappointed, I managed a quick midweek overnight trip to see my parents instead. The morning after my visit, I checked my email and found a vague message from the Airbnb host about an incident involving a resident's death the previous night. My mind immediately raced to David. I opened a local news app and was met with a shocking headline: an active shooter situation at my Airbnb building, resulting in the shooter's death during a SWAT team standoff. According to the news, David had confronted another resident with a gun and then barricaded himself in his apartment, claiming he was heavily armed. He had called 911, ranting about his neighbors hacking his phone and threatening violence. The situation escalated quickly, with David firing at people in the parking lot from his window. Residents, including those in my hallway, were trapped in their apartments, ducking for cover from the gunfire. A police sniper, positioned in a building across the street, had a clear line of sight into David's apartment. In a decisive action, the sniper shot David through his window. A drone later confirmed his death, with the gun still in his hand. Miraculously, no other residents were injured. Returning to the city, I was greeted by the sight of a bullet-riddled building and emotional neighbors. People who rarely interacted were now sharing tearful embraces and videos captured during the standoff. The relief of having been away during the incident was overwhelming. If not for my work commitment altering my plans, I would have been in the midst of that terrifying ordeal. The incident left a profound impact on me. I felt a mix of relief for my own safety and sorrow for David, a man who clearly needed mental health support but instead spiraled into violence. It was a stark reminder of the unseen struggles that can lurk behind closed doors and the fragile line between normalcy and chaos. My name is Anastasia, and I recently experienced a terrifying incident while staying at an Airbnb in a quiet Florida town. We had moved to this area about a year ago to be closer with my family. My aunt and her wife, and my cousins lived just a 10-minute walk from my Airbnb, which was situated in a somewhat rural area, despite being only 15 minutes from the outskirts of a major city. One evening, after spending the day at my aunt's house, I walked back home with my two little dachshunds. The evening was cold but serene, and I felt at ease as I returned to the Airbnb. After feeding my dogs and two birds, I settled in for a relaxed FaceTime chat with a friend. We were laughing and chatting away when I took out the trash, not realizing that this simple act would lead to a night of horror. Back inside, I continued my conversation, lying in bed while my bird, who had been with my family for 76 years, started making alarm calls. I initially dismissed it as her reacting to her reflection in the window, but then my friend's demeanor changed drastically. He looked horrified and urgently told me to go out of my room. Confused, I turned and saw the reason for his panic in my camera view. There was a man, a middle-aged and dressed in a gray pullover and dark pants, pressing his face and hands against the sliding glass door. His grin was chilling. My friend, trying to keep calm, instructed me to not look at him and go to my room. I was shaking uncontrollably, blubbering in my native language as I locked myself and my dogs in my closet. My friend, taking charge of the situation, said he'd be over in 10 minutes and call the police. I contemplated running to my mom's room to get the gun, ready to defend myself if the man broke in. Then, the tapping started. A slow, creepy rhythm on my window. My dogs began barking, and I was paralyzed with fear, convinced that these were my last moments. In desperation, I texted my aunt, who was about to leave for work, begging for her help in German. The tapping stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over, but then I remembered. I had the front door unlocked. The tapping resumed at my window, and I could do nothing but wait, praying for someone to arrive quickly. Relief came in the form of my neighbor's voice outside at 1 a.m. His pregnant wife, feeling nauseous, had gone out on their deck and had seen the unfamiliar man approaching my door. She woke her husband, who then came to investigate. I let my neighbors into the house, and soon my aunt arrived, armed and ready to protect me, followed by my friend. My home went from being a place of solitude to a gathering of concerned loved ones. The police arrived much later, taking what felt like an eternity. Thankfully, my bird was unfazed by the whole ordeal, and my dogs were just as happy to see familiar faces. Since that night, my friend has been staying with me. Even though an arrest was made, I find it hard to be alone. I'm forever grateful to my neighbor's instincts, my aunt's quick response, and my friend's support. Their actions undoubtedly prevented a much worse outcome. Three years ago, in the early days of 2020, when the world was just beginning to grapple with COVID-19, I found myself in a situation that still sends shivers down my spine. I had recently landed a new job in a small town in Texas and was in the process of finding a place to live. My sister generously offered her house, which was conveniently close to my workspace, about a 40-minute drive. She and her husband had moved out due to a long commute and left the house uninhabited. So I was grateful to move to the Airbnb, which is my sister's house, paying only for utilities and taking care of the property. After settling in for a couple of months, I had grown quite comfortable in my new home. However, one evening after returning from work, I noticed something peculiar, a cigarette butt on the curb near my house. As a smoker myself, I initially thought it might be mine, but upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't my brand. Dismissing it as a thoughtless act by a passerby, I continued with my evening. 2 days later, the situation escalated. I had found several more cigarette butts, this time on my porch. Annoyed and concerned that someone had been using my porch as a smoking spot, I cleaned them up, noting that they had seemed recently extinguished. That night, as I was watching a movie, I heard a car pass by, which was unusual given the suburban setting and the late hour during the pandemic. About half an hour later, I heard muffled voices nearby. Feeling uneasy, I paused the movie and listened intently. The voices grew closer, and I realized that they were approaching my porch, whispering now. Fearing a break-in, I quietly checked the front door to ensure it was locked. As I neared the door, the voices stopped. I decided to check out through the window, which had bars that could be unlocked from the inside. As I cautiously left the bars and moved the curtains aside, my heart pounded in my chest. The sight that greeted me was startling. It was a man, pressed up against the window, his face just inches from a glass. His eyes, a piercing blue, widened in surprise as they met mine. He was dressed in a nondescript hoodie and dark pants, and there was something unsettling about his gaze. For a moment, we had just stared at each other, frozen in a silent standoff. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he stepped back, pulling his hoodie tighter around his face to obscure his features. I could sense his panic, mirrored by my own. Before I could process what was happening, his accomplice, who had been lurking out of sight, began to violently kick at my door. The sound jolted me into action. I quickly slammed the window bars shut, locking them in place. My heart raced as I heard the thuds against the door, each kick sending a wave of fear through me. I dashed upstairs to the storage room, my mind racing with thoughts of what these intruders might do if they got inside. So I pushed a heavy table against the door, creating a makeshift barricade, and then dialed 911. My voice trembled as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, every noise from downstairs amplifying my fear. As I crouched in my hiding spot, waiting for the police to arrive, I heard a loud crash from the downstairs. The intruders were trying to force their way in through the window. The sound of the bars being shaken violently filled the house, followed by a long, angry scream from one of the men. It was a sound filled with frustration and rage, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. I was gripped by a sense of helplessness, praying for the police to arrive quickly. Eventually, the noises stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. When the police finally arrived, the intruders were gone. They had fled into the night, leaving behind a trail of fear and chaos. The officers took my statement and assured me that they would patrol the area, but the damage had been done. I no longer felt safe in the house that had been my sanctuary. In the days that followed, I struggled to come to terms with the incident. The feeling of violation of my personal space being invaded lingered long after the intruders had left. I decided to move out, unable to shake the memory of that night. I often think back to that night, grateful for my safety, but forever changed by the encounter.